World War II have been that much different if both sides just had magic missiles too?
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
Kyle Perkins.
I'm Jordan.
And it's just the three of us today. And before we get started, I just want to remind our listeners that you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And we have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help would be greatly appreciated. So our topic for today is that we're going to be talking about how to have a successful game with too many or too few players. We have a lot of experience in handling games with too many players. Our core group fluctuates between 6 and 8 or sometimes 9 players. So, we've had a lot of experience dealing with it, and we've hopefully picked up a few tidbits that can help out with managing that. One of the things that I've noticed is that it really depends on the game system that you're playing in more than anything else as to whether or not you're going to have a rough time dealing with a lot or too few players. I guess something we should go ahead and define right now is how many are too many or too few players. Personally, I think that a game with 3 or fewer is too few, and probably 7 or higher would be too many. What do you guys think?
You're saying not counting DM.
Not counting the DM.
Okay. I've had some pretty good games with 3 players and 1 DM, but I've never played with less than 3 players, and I think it would be weird.
Yeah, 3 is the minimum that I would do. I think once you get past 6, maybe 7 is when you really start getting log jam in communication. I don't know, I guess if you have the right players, really imaginative, outgoing people, you might be able to pull off too, but it just, I don't think there's enough personality there to create very many interesting dynamics.
I should maybe clarify slightly that I have been in a campaign with 3 players, 1 DM. 1 player couldn't make it, but was perfectly fine with the other 2 players continuing, and the session went fine because we already had a rapport. There was another person there, they just couldn't make that session. That was fine. But yeah, I imagine planning and starting out a game with just 2 players, yeah, there'd have to be a special circumstance there. Certainly extremely imaginative and motivated players. I guess if you were in some kind of 3-way marriage, it'd be a fun way to role play, but that's never happened to me. Never been married twice to 2 people at once living in the same house. A man can dream. What? Sorry, what? Guys, it's just me here. Someone has to make jokes. Someone has to do it.
Derail you before you went too far. I have, as a player, not run, but I have played in a game where I guess it was me, and at one time it was 1 other player, and some other times it would be 2 other players. There were other players in the group, but there were multiple situations, or multiple sessions where only 2 or 3 of us could show up, but the DM, we were playing a Star Wars game, and the DM loved NPCs, and over half of the crew was NPCs, and each one of them was very fleshed out, and this was a very animated, theatrical DM. So that was kind of a weird experience. I mean, you got to do a lot as a player if you wanted to, but it was a lot of sitting back and watching this person, turn into 6 different people at different times. So that was interesting.
I guess we're going to start with Too Small since that's what we've kind of gravitated toward. But I've been in 2 games where I was the game master with 2 players. In both instances, I had the same 2 players, and it was in different game systems, and it made me realize just how much the game system influenced whether or not that was too few or too many. The first time it happened was in a Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition game, and that was a disaster.
Yep.
Because the first one was in a D&D 4th edition game. The second was in a Savage Worlds Necessary Evil game.
That's the superhero one?
Yes, it's the super villain one.
Oh, right.
And the reason why one worked and the other didn't very easily boiled down to the fact that Dungeons and Dragons, regardless of edition, is built for 4 to 6 players. And Savage Worlds itself is like, it doesn't have classes. You are essentially doing a version of point buy for your characters, so you can kind of spread out the things that you are good at and that you can do. You are not a focused character in the same way that D&D and other class-based systems are. So you have the flexibility to be able to do the things that you need to do in order to make most situations work. You can put points into being a social character. You can also put points into being a combat character. And it's not much of a sacrifice in a game system like that versus D&D, where if you're playing a bard, you're going to be really limited in how you are balanced between fighting and talking and detecting traps and dealing with all of those, like dealing with hazards and dealing with the environment, dealing with being in the woods versus being in the city. It's those systems that are more specialized make it incredibly difficult to have a character who is too specialized in one thing but not in another.
Mm-hmm. 4th edition was particularly bad, even worse than other D&D editions, because they had an elaborate equation kind of worked out behind the scenes, and the whole economy of your abilities in that game was assuming that you had a finite number of people with particular roles, and they even had that weird system where you not only had classes but categories of classes. I can't remember them all. The striker and whatever
striker,
else.
Controller, leader, and defender.
Yeah, and if you were lacking, you were kind of fucked.
Yeah,
it felt like an MMO raid instead of just a freeform RPG. Have a good time with your buds. It was like, well, we were gonna do Molten Core tonight, but our fucking tank isn't here, so I guess we just won't.
If I'm not mistaken, right before 4th edition came out, like I think it was in the last days of 3.5, the World of Warcraft game came out, the tabletop role-playing game based on D&D. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that and Star Wars Saga Edition were 2 prototype efforts to make 4th edition, and both of those had that weird kind of player economy assumptions, and
which I find is kind of amusing that basically D&D or Star Wars Saga Edition was basically the proto 4th edition, but with 5th edition D&D, I see a lot of things that were in Star Wars Saga Edition that became D&D 5th edition rather than the things that just crashed and burned with 4th edition.
The extra dice thing happens a lot. I remember in Saga Edition, it was very hard to get +1 to something or whatever. It was much more often you get additional D20s in your roll. Is that what you're talking about?
That and the way that the skills worked and the way that basically hit points in general worked, the way you could heal them up.
Yeah.
It was a lot more... Like I've said it before, 5th edition is the best rules edition of D&D, in my opinion, that has existed.
I'm pretty impressed with it. Yeah. By the way, I think it's very appropriate that for this topic today, we're talking with the minimum number of podcasters at a time.
Well, Beth and I established that 2 is the minimum that we need for this podcast.
Is 2? Okay.
Yes.
Hey, if you've listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, all you need is 1, baby.
Yeah. One guy with a team of writers and researchers behind him.
Mm-hmm.
So, whenever I was running the game for just the 2 players, the vast majority of the time that was, well, no, not the vast majority of the time, but the majority of the extra time that I took in designing the scenarios was just in balancing the encounters, particularly in D&D 4th edition, where encounter balance was so micromanaged. Mm-hmm. It was nearly impossible to balance an encounter for just 2 players, because, like Jordan, you mentioned, you've got not only the specialties of your class, but you've also got like those roles, and those roles are built to do certain things. And if you don't have each one of those roles covered, there's going to be a gaping lack in what the players are able to do in combat. So if you don't have a striker, you're just not going to be able to deal enough damage to take enemies out fast enough for them to take you down.
Especially when you have fewer people with encounter and daily powers, and everybody's down to their at-wills, like, fast.
Yeah.
It's just a whittling game.
Well, in the 4th edition game that I ran, one of the ways that I tried to balance it out was, like, basically session 2, I realized how much of an issue it was, that I wasn't going to be able to fix the problem just by balancing the combat encounters. So I gave the player characters basically an NPC hireling that they had total control over. I balanced them out so that they weren't as complicated as a full-on character. I want to say that it might have been in the core Dungeon Master's Guide, but it might have been Dungeon Master's Guide 2. It had rules for making basically a supplementary character, and it helped. I still got into the issue of, like you were saying, the economy of having so many at-wills, so many encounter powers, so many daily powers, that you have to have those in order to blow through things as efficiently as what the rules assume you're going to. Mm-hmm. And I just didn't have that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so don't run 4th edition. Full stop.
Well, I feel like that's the same with any class-based system.
I don't know if 5th edition is like that because you don't have anything that is, aside from spells, I guess, but you don't have stuff that you can only do in a finite period of time. You've got basic attacks and, whatever derivations thereof, and I guess you still have your healing limits put on you, but it's not quite as bad because you're not dealing with, like, healing surges were a big deal in 4th edition. The at-will powers were kind of key to most things. But I've never felt, at least so far when we've been playing 5th edition, I've never felt like towards the end of the encounter that this character's about spent and I'm done with, except for hit points.
Mm-hmm.
I never felt like the things I'm able to do are any less than what they were at the beginning of the session. So, but it's more interesting, the game. I feel like the breadth of skills is better in 5th than it was in 4th. I like how the abilities that classes have, I think, are more interesting than just the stupid little attack powers that you got in 4th.
There are non-attack powers in 5th edition.
Yeah.
So, another thing that I learned in having just 2 players is just how much of a burden it is on the players to really carry the game, and how, like, not the players themselves, but just each individual player has much more of a burden in carrying the game, because the way I conceptualize the amount of screen time or spotlight time that a typical game has, I think the game master probably has maybe between 40 and 60% of all, like, attention, either through, like, interacting with NPCs, like saying words, describing the scene, all the minutia of running the game, and then the players have to share up the remainder of that percentage. Whenever you've just got 2 players, if they've still got 40% of the screen time, that means that both of them are taking up a full 20%. And if you don't have players who are comfortable with that, who are proactive enough to basically carry the story, to come up with the ideas that are going to propel whatever story you're going for forward, it's just going to crash and burn. Because if you've got players who aren't really proactive, they're just going to sit there. They're going to wait for the game master to present stuff to them.
Alternatively, I guess, if you had a DM who really liked to hear themselves talk, that could work. I mean, I know DMs that would be very happy to take up 80% of the time and have each player 10% chip in some things.
I would be exhausted.
Yeah.
If I was talking 4 hours out of a 5-hour game session, I'd be ready to sleep for 2 days.
Yep. I would definitely be hoarse.
I just had a thought. You know what game system might actually shine with only 2 players?
No, I don't, Kyle. Please enlighten us.
I'd love to, Clayton. Eclipse Phase. There's a lot of shit going on. It's very, very complicated. So combat with only 2 people might actually run smoothly. But also with that game being very, it's very likely that you're going to have people making, like, soft, what are you doing for this week-long period kinds of roles, or you're also very likely going to have players split up by geographic location. Your hacker is back on the ship doing some stuff in a room with a keyboard. Well, the other person is over on the space station, like fighting with a gun. And there's some robots with them. Why not? You have a lot of split up geographically, and things you're doing in that system, I think that they stand to be described out in greater detail. And so, again, they have to be self-motivated players, but with only 2 players doing some things in that crazy system, I don't know. I feel like it might work.
I think that it could, but with one really big caveat being that the players have to know Eclipse Phase. Mm-hmm. And this goes for pretty much any time you've got a small group. They have to kind of know the world that they're playing in, but especially in Eclipse Phase. If you don't know what the fuck you're doing in Eclipse Phase, you're not going to know what the fuck you're doing. Mm-hmm. And having too few players is going to make that even worse, especially players who are brand new, who don't know what skills they need. We had, 5 people in that game? 5 players?
More than that.
Okay.
But 6-ish, we'll say.
But we were still running into, none of us have that ability. Mm-hmm. None of us have enough skill in that in order to be effective in doing it. We don't have somebody who is both InfoSec and God, I can't even remember.
Fray.
Yeah, we don't have enough points to go into Fray and Freefall and melee guns.
While also hacking a terminal.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a different kind of game, what Kyle's talking about, if it's a small group of people. If you've got a couple people, 2, 3, whatever, that are kind of off doing their own things, they're not going to have that broad base of prerequisite skills. They'll do what they're good at, and that's what they're going to be doing for the session. They're interfacing with a sub-game that's bolted onto the rest of it. Whereas in the game we were playing, we were running it like D&D, where everybody's together and everyone's got to keep up. So everybody's got to know how to navigate in 0G, and everyone's got to know how to deal with computers and, all that. So it was kind of a weird marathon run where everyone's trying to keep up.
That was a good way to phrase that. Eclipse Phase has a ton of sub-games bolted on to some kind of core chassis. I'm not going to talk about that as a vehicle. I wouldn't write it. But if you have... you could theoretically do an entire Eclipse Phase campaign with any number of players, but it would be stupid with more than a couple, so we'll say 2 for the sake of continuing the example. 2 players, one is a, data miner, and the other is, an information broker. And you could do an entire Eclipse Phase campaign where the 2 of them sit in a room and make rolls through the mesh, and literally there'd be action sequences where they're trying to evade being caught by counter hackers, but they're just at their computer. And there would be exposition segments where they learn something and the DM talks about what they've learned. You could do an entire fucking game like that.
That's
and
how
I think
KD played it. I mean, he had no business leaving his room. He just sent his drone out to do stuff and, hacked what needed hacking.
Mm-hmm. Anyway,
one of the ways that could work, in Eclipse Phase or also in any other game, particularly in Eclipse Phase, where the amount of resources that you have really dictate how well you can do whatever you need to. And Eclipse 8 had a multitude of different resources that you could track. Giving your players more resources than what their level or what their competency would otherwise allow them to have is one way of balancing that out. So like in Eclipse Phase, if you had the resources to where you could basically fork your mind and have one version of you sitting at a terminal and the other version out operating in a synthetic body, you could specialize your own character into having several different roles that they fulfill at once.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good point.
You kind of do the same thing with World of Darkness if you have ghouls and stuff that are beholden to you, that you could have their own little storylines or whatever. But yeah, World of Darkness is another one that has a lot of weird little subsystems. And in that game, if you've got 6 players and each one of them have 3 or 4 contacts that are significant to them, then forget about it. I mean, erase all but 1 or 2 of them, and that's the game you're going to be playing.
Yeah, if you've only got a couple players, the NPCs, the role of NPCs is going to increase, not only in just giving information, but also being helpful allies. So that's another burden that would be on the player or the game master, is to make those characters who the players want to interact with, and allow the players to go to them for any assistance that they need. Like they need an extra hand on this mission, so they can go to whoever it is who runs the mercenary guild, and they can hire a couple of additional people to go along with them.
You guys are making me want to play in smaller games. I miss NPCs. I miss running NPCs. I miss meeting NPCs.
Well, it's hard for a DM to even remember all of the stuff that each player has going on, even when it's just them. But when you connect a social network to each individual person as well, I mean, there's no way that a DM's going to be able to keep track of, the net total of, 30 characters. Most of them are NPCs that are tied into this group of individuals. And it sucks to spend a bunch of time on, backstory with this and that contact and whatever you might have, and it just never comes up because who's going to remember all that? And, I can't do it as a DM, and I don't expect others to do it, but it's a system that's in a lot of these games, and, it just kind of gets swept under the rug unless somebody's, bringing it up intentionally, But that precludes, most likely, hey, you get a call from your contact down at the precinct, blah, blah, blah. The DM forgot you had the fucking sergeant on your payroll.
Yeah. Whenever you've only got a couple people, it's a lot easier to remember who all their connections are, and to make those characters compelling, those NPCs that they come into contact. You have few enough NPCs that you got to play that you can easily take on a distinct voice and persona for each one of them. They don't just become, oh yeah, what was that one guy back in town? I can't remember anything about him. I don't even have his name written down, so I'm just going to use my generic speaking voice to inhabit them. Whereas maybe the first time you encountered them, it was a really cool NPC that you played. You had a specific drawl to your accent, and you did certain mannerisms. That information just becomes lost, even if you take really good notes, because I never remember to write down all of the things that I need to remember each NPC if I've got a lot of them that I'm blowing through.
How do you take notes on what specific accent you were doing too? I know that you spend a lot of time practicing accents, and you have to come up with new ones and be good at ones you want to be good at. A lot of times, I might do an accent for an NPC just because it's fun, and it actually ends up being something I enjoy and the players enjoy. And then exactly as you said, 2 sessions later, how did that person sound again? I don't know.
Well, in my pregame prep, I cannot do this during the session, but in my pregame prep, the way I establish accents or figure out who I'm going to, I usually base an accent on somebody. Either it's a character in a movie, and then next to that character's information I put sounds like this character in whatever, or sounds like as played by a particular actor. There is also a very, very good resource called Arc. Now I can't remember what it's called. It's something like accentarchive.org, and I found this in 2001, 2002. And it's still up there. Some graduate student was doing research in linguistics, and he just put it out onto the internet for people to record this paragraph that basically goes through and has all the important accents that a person has whenever they're speaking. And so there are literally thousands of different people's accents in English from all over the world. So if I need to have a Scandinavian accent, I choose somebody from Norway. And there's for instance, there are 3 male voices from Norway who, one of them lived in Norway all his life. One of them moved to the U.S. when he was to come to college. So you get a variety of accents, not only of where they are geographically, but where they may have picked up other accents along the way. And I just download that, and I have it on my computer that I can listen to whenever I need to get into that character or try to pick up that accent.
It's a cool resource. Was it through George Mason University by chance?
I don't remember.
When I searched for Accent Archive, the top result is the Speech Accent Archive. It's
that is it.
accent.gmu.edu.
Cool.
And it's a pretty simple looking interface. You just browse sound clips. Yeah, check that out. accent.gmu.edu.
Link in the show notes.
Something I realized is that, and I'm personally running out of experience with smaller games to draw from because, as I said, I haven't had that many. But when talking about compelling NPCs and unique NPCs are much easier to do. And also we've talked about how a smaller game might facilitate some weird ideas that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise, like a couple of hackers spend the entire campaign in a room the whole game. And so I guess this kind of makes me think about like that it really is easier to do a more serious tone or a more unique style that you stick to when there are fewer players. There's just fewer vegetables in the soup, so to speak. People say that, right?
You do.
You just did. You can also do more traditional stories, I think, with a smaller group. We've talked about this a couple times before. When you've got, 6 or 7 people or whatever in a whatever game, there's not a lot of narrative history to draw on for a story that really focuses on that many people besides TV shows. That's really the only thing. But if you're going into, a lot of movies and most literature, you're really looking at 1 or 2 people, maybe 3, as the main characters of the story. And, if you try to have a movie that really focused on that many people, unless it's like a Tarantino thing or something like that, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. You don't have a well-crafted narrative arc that you can, keep these 5 or 6 individuals, closely weaved together. And, all our mythology is a hero, maybe a hero and hero's buddy, whatever. So when you got fewer people, I think things make more sense from a storytelling perspective.
Yeah. Jordan, I'm going to do something you love, which is throw words into your mouth and
do it.
Just say that
I'm wide open.
J.R.R.
Oh, God, he's unhinging his jaw. Oh, Jesus.
Whenever he wrote The Hobbit, which has 14 different dwarves, there are not 14 different dwarf characters. There is 1, maybe 2 dwarf characters, and then there's all the others that end with their name ending in oin.
Yep. It's a group, cluster of dwarves.
Yep.
That is around. Even in Lord of the Rings, where he tries to have a little bit more going on, most of the other characters are just there for occasional flourish. I mean, Legolas really doesn't add anything in the book. He's there in the movie a lot more.
He's just Aragorn's buddy in the novels.
The only thing I can think of, the Tarantino stuff is a good example because looking at Pulp Fiction, lots of different characters, lots of different stories, loosely related, but it's a very rare group of players that want to sit there for 45 minutes while half the party gets the spotlight, and then the other half gets the spotlight, and then maybe a few sessions down the road, what they've been doing separately comes together in a cool, whoa, scene.
And then one kills another.
Yeah.
While they're on the toilet or something.
So that's cool. If you have a group of people that are willing to do that, you can do some unique stuff with it, but that's the exception to the rule. I do think of heists, Ocean's 11, stuff like that. Pretty big cast of characters. Most of them get relatively equal kind of time there.
Those movies suck most of the time, though.
I think a good heist movie is all right. As long as you got Mini Coopers. Everyone has to have a Mini Cooper. It's interesting to think that we do have such, thousands of years of storytelling focused around one hero, and then here we are doing a hobby that tries to focus around 4 to 6 heroes.
Mm-hmm. You started to talk about just having all of those players, and how do you adjust the spotlight for them? Like, you can't just have half the group having, particularly in a large group. It's a lot easier to do in a small group, but you can't do it in a large group, of having just go off to the side and have this quick little aside where half the players are engaged and the other half aren't. I feel like in a big group, it's terrible to have the group split up. From what I've seen, large groups want to split up. They want to fracture as soon as they get an opportunity to go and accomplish 2 goals at once. Mm-hmm. You can handle that in a small group because, like, it's easy to, like, if you've only got 2 players, do something and the other person can, like, sit there and intently listen, or they can take on the role of an NPC during that time. But whenever you've got a big group and you split the attention, that's when the phones come out and people start checking Facebook. It's when people start playing games on their phones or whatever they do to pass the time, because they are not engaged. They're not paying attention to what's going on. And a large group is even worse about that.
Well, I think that groups, tending to want to split when they get so large is a pretty natural reaction, because I understand why from the DM perspective you would want everybody to stick together because it's easier to manage. But when you're a player, it's though it doesn't make sense mathematically, it feels more rewarding and enjoyable to have a quarter of the time, half the time, than have, an eighth of the time, all the time. Does that make sense?
I see what you're saying, yes.
So, I'd rather have a significant role in half of the game than have a completely ancillary role for the entire thing. Mm-hmm. And, also it doesn't make a lot of sense most of the time unless you're, a fucking SEAL team clearing a building, why you would have that many people clustered that closely together the whole time. Mm-hmm. Are we all going to go shopping together? Yeah. Are we all going to go, check out our lead, mm-hmm. whatever it is. And another thing, as far as games that involve, tension and horror and stuff like that, run a scary Call of Cthulhu game where you got 8 people clustered together constantly. You just lose so much when you don't have a few people off on their own vulnerable.
You lose it whenever you've got a big game group, period, because you cannot maintain the tension, the focus with that large of a group. Mm-hmm. People's attentions wander anyway, but whenever you've got multiple people, it seems like their attentions wanders so much more quickly. And like the Apocalyptia Factions game, I feel like that was a very good, like, you handled that really well. And I think the reason why that worked is because we, as the players, had the initiative and the opportunity to pull another player aside and say, hey, this is what we're doing while everybody else is out there doing this thing. And we didn't need to bring you as the game narrator along with us to mm-hmm. basically chaperone the interaction. We had the freedom to interact with each other on our own, either mm-hmm. PC to PC or through our intermediaries.
That was a weird game to run for that reason. One thing I learned in that game is exactly that I don't have to be there all the time. I would eventually want to know what happened just for world continuity, but yeah, my reflex would always be prior to that, I need to hear everything that's going on in case I've got to interject something to do with the world that players don't know. But it was kind of a relief to be able to just let these folks occupy themselves with their interpersonal concerns while I'm trying to forward a story on another side of it. Yeah, I don't want to say scary, but it was a little anxious to just kind of let a thing develop. Mm-hmm. And then, I hear what the players are doing. I'm like, oh, I guess that's in the world now.
I think it would take a very unique situation or a very unique group of people to make the tension of a horror game or a survival game work with that many players. We made it work at the retreat but that was a pretty special circumstance.
Yeah, I can find you all out in the middle of nowhere, and there was nothing else for you to do. Nowhere to go, nowhere to hide.
If you're listening to this, please help. I've been trapped in this cabin ever since the retreat. He won't let us leave. Yeah, that was cool. That worked out well. It was unique and something that none of us had ever done before. And frankly, we shit on it a lot, but more akin to LARPing than we might want to admit to ourselves. But, barring that, like, another example I could think of would be if you were to host, like, a murder mystery party, which people are encouraged to be in character the whole time. It's just LARPing for normies. I've been to one of those. It works out, but you have to have people willing to sit there and stay in character, or sit there and just not be a distraction and hopefully pay attention to what the other 7 people are doing, so that when it's their time to act, they don't be like, okay, catch me up, what was just going on? Because that sucks. Nothing worse than that.
Another thing about being a player in a group that's together, that is a large group all the time in, let's say, a combat, if we've got 8 players and I'm there at the scene, even if I'm trying to pay attention to how the dynamics have changed really it's 8 turns, because the DM's going to do something too, between my actions, I get lost every single fucking time. Even when I'm really interested in what's going on, I mishear something someone says, I don't realize the results of some roll someone made, and so every single time I'm going to have some kind of catch up, or just blindly throw an attack at whatever the closest enemy is. So, though it is easier to manage as a DM, you're asking a lot of people's attention. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know, there's a critical limit there. I guess now's as good a time as any to talk about the study that I found.
Go for it.
So, I was just reading about this study. It's like 10 years old. They were looking at how many discrete pieces of information people could keep in their working memory at a given time reliably. And they were doing like a memory card kind of game, and they did all these different controls to make sure that people weren't able to use like common strategies to create mnemonics to keep it all together. And what the findings were was that on average people can keep, on the low end, 3, on the high end about 4 items in their mind at a given time. And there are edge cases where people can do hundreds of things, but those are way off on the extreme end of the distribution. But most people, they're not going to be able to keep track of what 8 different combatants have been up to, or the interpersonal politics of 8 different players, much less NPCs. People are always going to be kind of just making up some filler and just working on their best guess as to what's actually going on. So that's the best cognitive case that I've ever seen for keeping group size, pretty small. Mm-hmm. You don't want people to have perfect information, I guess, in role-playing games. You don't want it to be like a chessboard, but much more than that, and you just feel like you're drowning in information.
Yeah. Whenever I run small groups, I love to do theater of the mind. I don't like to have a grid. I, as a player and I, as a game master, just, in most cases, prefer to game without a grid. Either in combat or just having a representation of, just in combat in general. I hate having a grid. But whenever you get too many players, it becomes essential that you have a grid in combat. And I would recommend that if you got a big group of players, have a sheet of paper or something out that you have miniatures for a big group of people. And if this group is over here, you just put a circle around them and write whatever location they are and put them in there and say, this group is over here, this group is over here, this other character is over here. That way you have a physical representation that everybody can look at and see where everybody is, like in a role-playing situation, if some people are there, some people aren't. Or if you're in combat, grid becomes absolutely necessary, because you were talking about people can only remember, keep track of 4 things. Well, if you've got 6 player characters and probably 5 to 10 enemies that you're keeping track of, hell, the game master can't keep track of that.
Right.
And they've got the initiative in front of them, and they've got the they're tracking who has how many hit points and everything, it just becomes nearly impossible for the game master to keep track of.
I do think you could leverage those cognitive limits, though, and do interesting things, not in combat, but in plot. So, have you guys read the Illuminatus trilogy?
I got the first one upstairs,
that?
but I haven't.
Really great. I recommend it to anyone. So the basic idea is, there's this secret organization that's been around forever, blah, blah, blah. It ties in all these different elements of pop culture and psychology and history and yada, yada, yada. But one of the themes that comes up is that the secret organization often organizes their conspiracies with 5 elements that have complicated relationships between these different elements, so that it gets so absurd to believe that all these things are working together that people just reflexively say, no way, that's too complicated to exist. So if you're doing some kind of mystery or conspiracy story or something like that, if you've got that crazy conspiracy diagram of a ton of different interested parties, all linked together in these convoluted ways, that could be a cool thing to have to, peel apart. I was doing that in your Eclipse Phase game, trying to figure out how all the dots connected. So that puzzle is itself a sub-game that when you've got time to work it out and, a piece of paper to plot all this stuff out on, that's engaging. I don't want to do that round by round in a combat, though.
Mm-hmm. So, Jordan, kind of going off of what you just said about basically chunking information and all of that, one of the ways that we've talked about on here of splitting that up, but I don't think any of us have actually done, is like just having a co-GM at the table whenever you've got a big group to kind of like take care of those things. I've done little things that are kind of co-GM-ish, like putting initiative tracking on that responsibility on one of the players, usually having a player at the beginning of the session volunteer to keep track of the initiative and like mark off or count up how much damage, for instance in D&D, how much damage an enemy has taken, and they just update me each time, and then I'll say, okay, that enemy is dead now, so you can go ahead and cross it off the list. That's pretty much the only thing that I've really done to help reduce the amount of mental load that I've got, because combats are where I really get brain fog whenever I've got too much information to deal with at once.
Oh, yeah. I have done that, not with this group, but with older groups. One game, I had a co-GM, and I use them almost exclusively for combat. I'd give them a group of enemies, and they would just roll for those, and that worked out okay. I don't know if I would ever try using that for anything but combat stuff, though, because you have to maintain a coherent world for that to work, and there's just no way that you're going to be able to keep everything straight between the two of you. I've also played in a game where there were multiple DMs. In that one, it was they split it up for combat, and they also tried splitting up for out-of-character conversation stuff, because it was one of those situations where we couldn't say no, and we had like 9 players and 2 DMs. And I think essentially what we decided was that we should just split the game into 2 different games. But I think the whole thing wound up just dying. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it got to be too much of a mess, because multiple times when the party would come back together, everyone's there, somebody would bring something up, the DM who's the primary then didn't know about it, and so then it's blushing and stumbling and improv, and you just can't maintain consistency.
Yeah. It's the same issue with whenever you split up a group and like you allow a different amount of time to pass for one group than the other.
That's tough.
And you always run into paradoxes or, wait, if I had known that, I wouldn't have done what I did.
Yeah. How didn't I hear that explosion from the other side of the building?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jordan, I've had exactly those 2 situations. I've had a co-DM that handled combat and rules intricacies, but mostly combat. And then I was also in a large game that had 2 DMs. The party ended up splitting into 2 sessions, and then the game ended up falling apart. I'm not saying that's going to happen every time. I think that I've heard of games that were big splitting into 2 games that met on different days, and that working fine. So, like, that's a valid idea. I'd even recommend that idea if you're facing yourself with, like, 10 people want to play in my game because they think I'm awesome. Well, maybe split that into 2 games. And you can have those games talk, back and forth, relay party information to each other. That's cool. But anyway, yeah, funny that I've had those exact same things happen to me. Mm-hmm. But I'm about to launch into something that I've never done before for our current D&D 5e game in a homebrew world that I'm running right now for us. We are about to begin a more political intrigue kind of cycle of the game. And so what I'm kind of looking at doing is having a member of our group who has moved away and wants to, like, hang out with us. They haven't found a group out there where they've moved to yet. And, I'm a bleeding heart, and so I'm allowing it. Also, I miss them, but they really want to, like, play and be around us. And so I was thinking that for some of the political intrigue, if I were to give this person... Has Corey been on the podcast? Can I just say their damn name?
She has not been on the podcast. I will bleep it out.
All right.
So actually, I'll ask her permission if we can use her name.
Love you, bleep.
This person, she will be given descriptions, motivations, and personalities of some characters, NPCs, and I'm going to have them message, like, text the players, or maybe even sometimes take a tablet with FaceTime or voice chat, video chat, into another room with some players, and just have them do some in-character political intrigue stuff. Gonna kind of give them carte blanche, knowing what those characters are, how they would behave. And hopefully this isn't going to come crumbling down. Obviously, like, major stuff will still be done by me, but I just don't know how else to handle 8 players in a large city, much like King's Landing from Game of Thrones, where you have lots of political factions all happening at once, big bustling city. People are not going to want to, and shouldn't have to, have 8 people going shopping together. 8 people talking to that lead together. That's dumb. So, I'm going to try something I've never done and have a more kind of role-play code DM, sort of. More like NPC Wrangler. We'll see how it goes.
That's going to be an interesting experiment. I would highly recommend the assistant DM as bookkeeper for combat things and, logistics and whatever. I have no idea how you're going to keep things together storyline-wise.
Yeah, I don't know. I am going to have a text chat on my laptop with this person, so I don't have to pull out the phone and text them. So, like, they're going to be on their computer, I'm going to be on mine, and we can rather rapidly talk to each other. But I am going to, like, ask them to, hey, as this NPC, can you text Jordan? And, now you have some secret information that NPC's told you. I don't know. I'm going to see how it works.
Maybe you should get, like, a FBI earbud where she could just, like, whisper things to you while you're in the middle of talking.
That'd be pretty cool. I mean, I do have a Bluetooth headset that I haven't used since my PS3 gaming days. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I'll fill back in a future podcast about how this experiment succeeds.
As far as, like, having NPCs in a game whenever you've got a lot of players, I think that the fewer NPCs you have, the better. Because you've got enough personalities, hopefully you've got enough personalities sitting around the table, that they only need to go to NPCs for plot-relevant information. I know whenever I was running a beta, we had a few sessions where I literally only gave descriptions of where you guys were going. All of the other information, all the other interaction that happened during a session or two, like whenever you were in the human city getting ready to get your boat, like whenever you were in the elven city after the big climactic fight with the Vikinger, I let you guys have carte blanche in those cities, and you guys just went off and did your things. I only role-played maybe 1 or 2 NPCs during that session, and the entire rest of the session was just you guys interacting with each other. Mm-hmm. And if you've got a big group, the game master, one, should allow the players to have all of the spotlight time that they can have. Mm-hmm. And 2, allow the players to completely dictate what's going to happen for a while. Mm-hmm. Don't give them any sort of constraints. Just let them have fun, because you're the game master. You're going to be talking a lot anyway. Anything you can do to reduce the amount of time that you as the game master is talking whenever there's a big group is just going to improve the game.
That is a little tricky, though, counting on players to generate some content, because you have to give them some, story resource to draw off of. If it's just 9 people, walking across the plains, going to their destination, and everybody knows what they're doing, and there's not really anything else going, there's nothing to talk about. If, people are having to make decisions and, weighing, each other's goals and all that kind of stuff, that's awesome. Mm-hmm. You can definitely let players do a lot of stuff there. But yeah, it's all predicated on, here's this problem that doesn't have an obvious solution. How are we going to approach this?
Mm-hmm. Well, something that worked, because it was Savage Worlds, and I used the prompts of the cards, where one person draws a card to basically prompt them into giving some information about their backstory. We did an entire session where you guys were just traveling from one location to another, and at the beginning of the session, 2 people drew their I don't remember what they're called, but basically just their background story that they share at that time. And pretty much nothing else happened that session except for you guys interacting on the ship, sailing from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. And it was just, we had so many strong role players that were willing to just take and run with whatever got put in front of them, that I really didn't have to do hardly anything for those entire sessions. And it felt like everybody had fun during those sessions. It wasn't just 1 or 2 people talking the whole time.
Mm-hmm. I like that particular sub-mechanic in Savage Worlds. I feel like that is a necessary thing to get everybody involved, is to have some prompt to go off of. If you hope that that's going to happen spontaneously, you're going to wind up with, 1 or 2 particularly histrionic players just going on and on about their, 10-page backstory.
Mm-hmm. And I also feel like having a prompt, some sort of prompt to basically get that interaction going, is absolutely essential, regardless of how many players you've got. Asking the players, what do you do when they don't have anything to do, is absolutely kills the mood of the game. And you've just got a whole bunch of people, well, I don't know, I just sit on the ship and I look off into the horizon. You get like between 3 and 7 responses of, I just look off on the horizon, I sleep, I'm
going to practice my sword fighting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I've noticed that whenever you ask players, like if, particularly at the beginning of a campaign, if you ask players, what are you doing? They almost always say things that they are doing alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lifting weights.
Yep.
It's funny how effective player characters are with their downtime when people are not.
Oh yeah,
they're always optimizing themselves in every possible way, but you as a person, I'm watching TV.
Player characters have no conception of what downtime actually is. Downtime is getting ready for the next thing.
Mm-hmm. Prepping.
Yep.
Do you want to do recommendations of nerd shit or?
Absolutely. I've got a really big one coming up. Actually, whenever this episode drops, it'll probably be mostly done. But the newest edition of Savage Worlds is having a Kickstarter going on for Savage Worlds Adventure Edition, because Savage Worlds can't go by numbers. They have to have Savage Worlds Revised, Explorers Edition, Deluxe Edition, Deluxe Explorers Edition, and now Adventure Edition.
And that is a straight-up new version of the game?
New versions of Savage Worlds are more like iterations. There have been quite a few improvements in the way that the skills are handled, a few other minutiae that only somebody who is fluent in Savage Worlds would really pick up on at first blush. But I think from what I've seen, there have been a few teasers released of some of the changes. I really like the changes that have been made.
I'm going to hold out for Explorer Deluxe Adventure Edition.
I want Adventure Deluxe Explorers Edition.
I don't know yet whether or not the Adventure Edition is going to come in the $9.95 book that has everything you need and to run the game, and you never have to buy anything more. There will probably be a little bit higher price point than that because it's hard to keep a rules book at $9.99 over the course of 15 years.
Yeah. Dollar didn't go as far as it used to.
Yep.
I got one. Heat Blur Studios is getting ever closer to releasing their F-14 module for Digital Combat Simulator. Every fucking switch, every glorious Tomcat button can be pushed and toggled and manipulated and twiggled. I can't wait. I am pumped to not know what the fuck I'm doing by jumping into a multi-million-dollar 80s fighter jet.
I love toggling and twiggling.
Have you played Elite Dangerous?
No.
Because although I don't know about actually flying aircraft, it took me a half an hour to complete the how to operate your spacecraft tutorial in Elite Dangerous.
Oh, that's awesome. That's my bread and butter.
It took me a half an hour to successfully basically fly into a station and land. That is the tutorial.
Hell yeah.
Awesome. All right, I got a film recommendation. This movie, The Witch. It's really cool, really creepy. It's set in like early colonial America kind of setting, you know, Jamestown, whatever kind of thing. And it's about this family that gets exiled from their settlement and are trying to, you know, go it alone homesteading. And then all this weird witchcraft shit starts happening. And the thing that I found really interesting about it is that most or all of the dialogue comes directly out of like court records and diaries and stuff from the period. So I had to watch the whole thing in closed caption because the accents are great, but the dialogue is so bizarre. You know, the grammar of that era of English is very strange, but it was extremely well done. Very weird, moody, Cthulhu-y almost horror movie. So I would recommend that one quite a bit. It's on Netflix.
It's worth mentioning. Have you guys, I know, well, the listeners don't know. Have either of you guys seen Westworld?
Yeah.
Clayton, have you?
I have not actually seen Westworld.
I recommend it.
I saw the first season. I haven't seen the second yet.
I just watched the first episode, and it's pretty great. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Right.
You know, no Yul Brynner, but doesn't need it.
Got a Cyclops instead, didn't it?
James Marsden.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And
not to mention Sir Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah, I was about to say, and Odin.
Mm-hmm. Odin, that's the go-to for Anthony Hopkins now. Yeah.
One
signature character.
That's the role he's known for.
It's got one of the astronauts from the ill-fated Apollo 13 mission, too. It's impressive that he's still acting. Ed Harris is in it. That's the joke. What do you say we quit this bullshit?
All right, let's stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice. This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.